This week's instalment of Learning How to Light is all about something called feathering, which is basically a very fancy term for the angle you place a light at. It might seem very, very simple, but as we'll see, even the tiniest change in angle can actually make quite a big difference.
Now let's talk about a fancy sounding thing called feathering. Now feathering is related primarily to direction, but it also affects quantity and to a lesser extent quality. At a basic level, it just refers to the angle of light. But being more specific, we're talking about angling a light so that we create certain effects on our subjects with respect to how the intensity of the light falls off from the centre of a light source to the edges. We might imagine that the light emitted from something like a beauty dish, like something like this, is perfectly even from edge to edge. But of course, if we were able to measure the fall of light accurately from something placed in the centre, something lined up to the edge, we'd find that it was much stronger in the centre and less light reached things that were in line with the edges of the light cast by it. Stop for a minute and think about this, and it becomes obvious. Put yourself mentally in front of the light, and if you stand dead centre, you'll see the whole face of the light square on. As you move to one side, you can now see less and less of the light, and consequently there will be less falling on you and you will be darker. You can see how if this imaginary person was to start in the middle and then move off away to one side, how less of the light would reach them, and how much further the light from each side would have to travel the further away they get from it. And of course we know that as light has to travel a further distance, the quantity is reduced because it's scattered more. So the further away they are from the opposite edge of the light, the less of that light will be falling on them. It's got further to travel. Yep, hope we get the whole quantity principle here. Now it's obvious if I take this beauty dish and point it right at you. Okay, now, bright, isn't it? Now, as I angle it away, you'll be able to see less and less and less of the light. Obvious? Yep. Now, although I've moved the light, I swing it back to straight onto you, although I've moved the light, it has exactly the same effect as if you had moved in relation to it. So you are seeing less of it here, you will be darker, whereas here, when you're dead centre to it, you will be brighter. Now the fall off in the intensity of light is gradual, and it will vary, of course, depending on what type of modifier you are using. The softer the modifier, the softer the light that modifier creates, the more gradual will be that fall off. And conversely, if you use a very hard modifier, something that creates a very hard light, then the drop off in intensity from the brightest part of where the light is falling to the darkest will be much more dramatic. This transition is the feathering. It's how the light gradually loses its intensity around the edges of a light. That is the feather, if you will. The effect of feathering is accentuated by using something called grids. Now we're going to talk about grids in more depth later on. We talk about various light modifiers, but we can see straight away what happens if I add a grid to this beauty dish. I have one conveniently located here on the sofa next to me. I take this grid, and if you look, it's like a honeycomb system. There you can see a light passing through it, and what those various metal black honeycombs do is they channel the light. So if I turn this back on and point it straight at you, the feathering happens much more suddenly. Looking straight at the light as you are, the light is able to travel straight through the bits in the grid, but I've only got to turn it very, very slightly. And how much darker does everything get? Because the grid is channeling the light away from you. And by the time we go over here, no light at all is hitting you because the grid is blocking those light rays from coming from the opposite sides. You can only see things straight on, and then the fall off is very, very dramatic. So a grid accentuates feathering. You can get grids, as we'll talk about later, for lights like that, for smaller, harder lights, and for softboxes. They're very, very handy tools. What's great about grids is that the quality of light doesn't actually change. The light itself is, of course, still the same size. That's still a beauty dish. What you've done is channel it down. You've increased the intensity with which the light feathers and falls off, but kept the quality the same. So if you wanted a soft, flattering light, but didn't want that light to spill all over the place and affect different areas of your shot. If you placed a grid on the light, it would limit where the light fell and it would allow things to feather more dramatically, but it would still be a soft light. Returning to our top-down diagram, we can see how the grid has channeled the light down into just the light being cast directly out the front of the beauty dish. Almost none is spilling off to the sides anymore, just as what happened when I pointed the beauty dish at you and twisted it away. Now in practice, feathering allows you to carefully control where your light is falling. You can use feathering to light your subject with a soft flattering light, but keep that light off the background in order to keep it darker, or light it separately. This portrait image of golfer Luke Donald was lit from the right of camera with a beauty dish, so still a fairly soft flattering light, but it was feathered in such a way that it hits him and not the wall behind him, even though the wall is actually quite close to him. I then added a second light to put some light on the back wall. The fact that the light was feathered off the wall and just on Luke means that I was able to light them as two separate objects. Now this can be very, very useful in small, tight areas like this where you want to create some depth to an image. Feathering allows me to keep the light on the subject, in this case Luke, and not on the back wall, and therefore I can light the back wall as a separate thing. You can also use feathering to create a dramatic change in tone from highlight to shadow across a small area, such as a face. This image was lit with the exact light I've just demonstrated to you with, a beauty dish with a grid on. It was angled very carefully to keep the top of Joel's face in highlight and let his neck drop off into shadow. As you can see from this setup shot, Joel is seated in the chair, or would be, I realise he's not there right now, but you know where he'd be sitting. And if you look closely, you can see that the beauty dish is not pointing straight at him. It's angled slightly off and is only be striking the top of his head. I've feathered it so that rather him being in the middle of the sweet spot of the light, he's closer to the edge, so the fall off across him happens quite dramatically. So, feathering is basically a fancy name for angling the light, and it obviously functions as part of direction, but of course it has an effect on quantity because that's what's happening, the quantity is dropping off, and of course to a minor extent it does have an effect on quality, but as I say, you can basically start with the same modifier and perhaps use a grid to intensify the effect of feathering, so it doesn't really affect quality too much. All that from just turning the light round a few degrees.
Okay, that was feathering in a little bit of depth. Next week we're going to move on to mixing different light sources. I'll see you then.